When a fertility doctor knocks on a single father's door at midnight with an impossible request, neither expects their clinical arrangement to shatter into something raw, unpredictable, and achingly real. What starts as biology becomes heartbreak. What begins as an agreement becomes a family no one planned for. But when hope turns to loss and fear drives her to vanish with his child, one man must decide how far he'll go to reclaim what he never knew he needed. This is a story about second chances, hidden truths, and the moment when four strangers became home. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story reaches across the world. The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, the kind of downpour that turned Seattle streets into rivers and made the whole city smell like wet concrete and pine. Mason Reed stood at his kitchen sink, dish towel in hand, watching water streak down the window above the faucet. The apartment was warm, almost too warm, with the radiator clanking its familiar rhythm and the faint smell of the spaghetti he'd made for dinner still hanging in the air. "Dad?" Lila's voice drifted from the living room, small and sleepy. "Can I watch one more episode?" Mason glanced at the microwave clock. 7:50, school night. She knew the rules. "You already watched two, kiddo," he called back, drying his hands on the towel. "Brush your teeth. I'll come tuck you in." "But it's a cliffhanger." "Life's full of cliffhangers," Mason said, smiling despite himself. "You'll survive." He heard her dramatic sigh, 8 years old and already fluent in theatrical disappointment, and the shuffle of her feet as she dragged herself toward the bathroom. Mason folded the towel over the oven handle, the kind of automatic gesture that came from years of doing everything himself. Single fatherhood had turned him into a man of routines. Wake at 6, pack lunch. Drop off at 7:45. Work until 4. Pickup. Homework. Dinner. Bath. Bed, repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady was what Lila needed. The knock came exactly at 7 o'clock. 3 sharp raps, urgent but controlled, like whoever stood on the other side of the door had been building the courage to knock for the last 10 minutes. Mason frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. His brother lived 2 hours south and always texted first. His coworker buddies knew better than to drop by unannounced on a weeknight. He crossed the small living room, past Lila's backpack dumped by the couch, past the stack of library books on the coffee table, past the framed crayon drawing of a lopsided house labeled Home in wobbly letters, and peered through the peephole. Dr. Elena Hart stood in the hallway. Mason's hand froze on the deadbolt. He'd seen her maybe a dozen times in the 2 years since she'd moved into the apartment directly across the hall. She was the kind of woman you noticed without meaning to. Tall, sharp-featured, with dark hair usually pulled into a sleek ponytail and an air of quiet competence that made her seem older than she probably was. Early 30s, Mason guessed. Maybe younger. It was hard to tell with people who carried themselves like they'd already lived 3 lifetimes. They'd exchanged pleasantries in passing. "Good morning. Cold out today. Have a good weekend." The kind of surface-level neighborliness that never went deeper because neither of them seemed interested in more. Mason had his hands full with Lila and his landscaping business. Elena worked long hours at some fertility clinic downtown. He'd overheard her on the phone once in the hallway, her voice clipped and professional as she talked about ovulation cycles and hormone levels. But she'd never knocked on his door before. And she'd certainly never looked like this. Even through the distortion of the peephole, Mason could see her face was pale, almost gray. She wore a white medical coat over dark slacks, like she'd come straight from work, and her hands were clenched at her sides. She looked terrified. Mason unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Dr. Hart?" he said, keeping his voice low so Lila wouldn't hear. "Everything okay?" Elena's eyes met his, and for a moment she didn't speak. She just stood there in the fluorescent hallway light, rain-damp and trembling, looking at him like he was the last solid thing in a world that had just collapsed beneath her feet. "I need to talk to you," she said finally. Her voice was tight, controlled, but barely. It's personal. Can I come in?" Mason hesitated. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. You didn't let near strangers into your home at night when your daughter was in the next room. You didn't open doors to trouble, no matter how well dressed it was. But then Elena swayed slightly, catching herself against the doorframe, and Mason saw it. The hairline fracture in her composure, the way her jaw trembled even as she tried to keep her expression neutral. She wasn't dangerous. She was breaking. "Yeah," Mason said, stepping back. "Come in." Elena stepped into Mason Reed's apartment and immediately felt like she'd walked into a different world. It wasn't the space itself. The layout was identical to hers, the same boxy living room and galley kitchen, the same builder-grade carpet and white walls. But where her apartment across the hall was sleek and minimal, all clean lines and empty countertops, Mason's was lived in. Warmly, undeniably lived in. There were drawings stuck to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets. A pink lunchbox shaped like a cat sat on the counter next to a half-full coffee pot. A small bookshelf overflowed with chapter books and picture books, their spines cracked from repeated reading. A knitted throw blanket lay bunched on the couch. The air smelled like tomato sauce and laundry detergent, and something else Elena couldn't quite name, something that felt like safety. "Sorry about the mess," Mason said, closing the door behind her. "Wasn't expecting company." Elena shook her head. "It's fine. She stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "It's perfect," she thought. "It's everything I'll never have." "Can I get you something?" Mason asked. "Coffee? Water?" "Water would be good." She watched him move into the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced. He was younger than she'd assumed when she'd first seen him in the hallway. Mid-30s, maybe, with the kind of lean, rangy build that came from physical labor rather than gym memberships. His brown hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar, and he had the permanent tan of someone who worked outdoors. Crow's feet bracketed his eyes when he smiled, which he did easily, even now, even with a stranger in his home looking half dead on her feet. He filled a glass from the tap and handed it to her. "Thanks," Elena said. Her hand shook as she took it. "You want to sit down?" She nodded, and Mason gestured to the small kitchen table pushed against the wall. Elena sank into one of the mismatched chairs, one wooden, one metal, like they'd been collected over time from different yard sales, and wrapped her hands around the glass without drinking. Mason sat across from her and waited. He didn't rush her, didn't pepper her with questions, just sat there with his forearms resting on the table, his expression open and patient, like he had all the time in the world. It was that patience that finally broke her. "I'm a fertility specialist," Elena said. The words came out flat, clinical, easier that way. "I work at Pacific Northwest Reproductive Medicine downtown. I've been there for 6 years. Before that, I did my residency at Johns Hopkins. I've helped," her voice caught, "I've helped hundreds of families have children." Mason nodded slowly. "Okay." "I'm very good at my job," Elena continued. "I know the science inside and out. I know the statistics, the protocols, the odds. I know exactly what works and what doesn't." "I believe you." Elena forced herself to meet his eyes. "I can't have children of my own." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable. Mason's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer the kind of empty platitudes Elena had heard 1,000 times from well-meaning colleagues. "You never know. Miracles happen. You could always adopt." He just said quietly, "I'm sorry." Elena felt something crack in her chest. "I've tried everything," she said, and now the words were coming faster, spilling out like she couldn't stop them. "IVF donor eggs, hormone treatments. I've gone through 4 rounds in the last 3 years. Every time I think maybe this is it. Maybe this time it'll work. And every time," she stopped, pressing her fingertips to her temples. "Every time it doesn't." "That must be hell," Mason said softly. "I'm 41, Elena continued. "My AMH levels are barely detectable. My ovarian reserve is—" She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I'm running out of time. And I know that. I know the odds better than anyone, but there's one more option, one last chance." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing it flat on the table between them. It was a printout from a medical lab, dense with graphs and numbers and terminology that would mean nothing to most people. "I have 1 viable egg left," Elena said. 1. The clinic retrieved it 3 weeks ago. It's frozen, waiting. But I need—" Her throat tightened. "I need a donor." Someone with excellent genetic markers. Someone healthy, young enough, someone I can trust. Mason looked down at the paper, then back up at her, and Elena watched the realization dawn in his eyes. "You want me," he said. "Yes." The single word seemed to echo in the small kitchen. Mason leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Dr. Hart." "Elena, please." "Elena," Mason said carefully. I'm honored, I think. But I don't understand. Why me? You don't know me. We've said maybe 10 words to each other in 2 years. I know more than you think, Elena said. I've watched you. That came out wrong. She saw Mason's eyebrows lift slightly, and she rushed to clarify. Not in a creepy way, she said. I mean, we live across from each other. I see you leave for work in the morning. I see you come home with your daughter. I hear her laugh through the walls sometimes. I see the way you are with her. The way I am with her? Patient, Elena said. Kind. You never yell. I've never once heard you lose your temper, even when she's being difficult. You pack her lunch every morning. You read to her at night. I can hear your voice through the walls sometimes, doing all the character voices. She smiled faintly. You're a good father, Mason. That's why I'm asking you, because I don't just need genetics. I need someone who understands what it means to love a child completely. Mason was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to say. You're asking me to father your child, he said finally. Yes. Through IVF, clinical, medical. Yes. And then what? Mason asked. You raise the baby alone? I just go back to my life like nothing happened? Elena had prepared for this question. She'd rehearsed the answer in her head a dozen times on the drive home from the clinic, in the shower, lying awake in bed at 3 a.m. I'm not asking you to be a father to this child, she said. I know you already have, Lila. I know you're doing this alone, and that's enough, more than enough. I'm just asking for, she faltered, for a chance, for help. I'll handle everything else, legally, financially, all of it. You won't have any obligations. I just need this one thing. Mason stood abruptly, walking to the window above the sink. He stood there with his back to her, hands braced on the counter, staring out at the rain. Elena waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This is insane, Mason said quietly. I know. You're asking me to make a decision that'll change your entire life, and mine. I know. And you think I'm just going to say yes, just like that? Elena closed her eyes. I'm hoping you will. The bathroom door banged open down the hall, and a small voice called out, Dad, I brushed for 2 whole minutes. Come check. Mason turned from the window, and Elena saw something shift in his expression, the automatic warmth that flooded his face at the sound of his daughter's voice. Be right there, Lila Bean, he called back. He looked at Elena, and she saw the conflict written across every line of his face. I need time to think about this, he said. Of course. I'm not saying no, Mason added quickly. But I'm not saying yes either. It's a lot. I understand. Elena stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt wrung out, emptied, like she'd just run a marathon and collapsed at the finish line. She'd done it. She'd asked. The rest was out of her hands. Mason walked her to the door, and as he opened it, he paused. Can I ask you something? He said. Anything. Why now? Why tonight? Elena looked down at her hands. Because I got the call this afternoon. My insurance is cutting off coverage. This is my last cycle. If I don't do this now with the egg they already retrieved, she swallowed hard. It's over. This is it. Mason's expression softened. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Elena said. Just think about it, please. She stepped into the hallway, and Mason started to close the door, then stopped. Elena? She turned back. I'll give you an answer by tomorrow night, he said. One way or another. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She walked across the hall to her own apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The space was dark and silent, exactly as she'd left it that morning. No backpacks by the door, no drawings on the fridge, no small voice calling from the next room. Elena set her bag down on the counter, walked to the couch, and sat down in the darkness. And then, finally, she let herself cry. What? Mason stood in Lila's doorway, watching her sleep. She'd fallen asleep almost instantly after he tucked her in, one hand curled under her cheek, the other clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. Her nightlight cast soft shadows across the room, illuminating the posters she'd taped to the walls, horses and butterflies, and a chart of the solar system she'd gotten for her birthday. 7 years. He'd been doing this alone for 7 years. Lila's mother had left when Lila was barely 1 year old, just packed her bags one afternoon while Mason was at work and disappeared. No fight, no explanation. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." Mason had tried to find her at first, called her parents, her friends, even filed a missing persons report. But Claire didn't want to be found. She'd made that clear when the divorce papers arrived 6 months later, forwarded from an attorney in California. She'd signed away her parental rights without hesitation. No custody battle, no visitation. She just left. For a long time, Mason had been angry, then hurt. Then gradually, something else had taken root. Acceptance, maybe. Or just the understanding that some people weren't built for this, for the relentless, grinding, beautiful work of raising a child. But Mason was. He'd learned how to braid hair by watching YouTube videos at 2 in the morning. He'd mastered the art of negotiating vegetables onto a plate and getting glitter glue out of carpet. He'd sat through parent-teacher conferences and school plays and doctor's appointments, always alone in a sea of couples, and he'd stopped feeling like half of something incomplete. He was enough for Lila, and Lila was enough for him. So why was he even considering Elena's request? Mason pulled Lila's door halfway closed and walked back to the kitchen. The lab printout still sat on the table where Elena had left it. He picked it up, studying the incomprehensible medical jargon. Genetic markers, viability, success rates. This was a human life they were talking about, a child, a person who would exist because of a choice Mason made right now, in this kitchen, with rain drumming against the windows. He thought about Elena's face when she'd said, "I'm running out of time," the rawness in her voice, the way her hands had shaken around the water glass. He thought about the hundreds of families she'd helped, the children who existed because of her work. He thought about Lila, asleep down the hall, and how completely his life had changed the moment she was born. How terrifying it had been. How impossible. How worth it. Mason's phone buzzed on the counter. A text from his brother, Jake. "You coming to the game on Saturday?" Lila's been asking. Mason smiled slightly and typed back, "She's playing you. She knows I'll say yes if you ask. Smart kid. Gets it from me." "Sure she does. See you Saturday." Mason set the phone down and looked at the printout again. He should say no. The logical part of his brain knew that. This was complicated, messy, potentially life-altering in ways he couldn't predict. He had enough on his plate already. He didn't need to take on someone else's dream, someone else's desperation. But logic had never been Mason's strong suit. What he was good at, what he'd always been good at, was seeing people, really seeing them, understanding what they needed, what they were too afraid to ask for. And Elena needed this. Mason folded the printout and set it on the counter. He'd make his decision tomorrow. Tonight, he just needed to sleep. But as he lay in bed an hour later, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain, Mason knew he'd already decided. Elena didn't sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes open, watching the red digits of her alarm clock tick from midnight to 1 to 2 to 3. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, every outcome, every way this could go wrong. He'll say no. Of course he'll say no. Why would he say yes? You're a stranger asking for the impossible. But what if he says yes? That thought was almost more terrifying, because if Mason said yes, then this became real, the final attempt, the last chance. And if it failed, when it failed, because Elena had learned not to hope anymore, she would have nothing left to try. At 4:30, she gave up on sleep and went to the clinic. The building was dark and silent, the waiting room empty, the lights motion-activated and flickering on as she walked through. Elena swiped her badge and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, to the embryology lab where her work, and her hope, lived in liquid nitrogen tanks kept at negative 196 degrees Celsius. She logged into the system and pulled up her own file. Heart, Elena. Age, 41. AMH, 0.03 nanograms per milliliter. Antral follicle count, 2. Diagnosis, diminished ovarian reserve. The numbers didn't lie. They never had. Elena scrolled through her treatment history. 4 IVF cycles. 12 eggs retrieved in total. 5 fertilized. 3 made it to blastocyst. 2 transferred. 0 implanted. And now, 1 egg left. 1 single, fragile chance. Why are you doing this? A colleague had asked her once, years ago, after her second failed cycle. Why put yourself through this when you know the odds? Elena hadn't had a good answer then. She still didn't. Maybe it was pride. The kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had gotten her through medical school, through residency, through every challenge she'd ever faced. Maybe it was grief, for the life she'd always imagined, for the children she'd never have, for the family that existed only in her head. Or maybe it was just the small, stupid, resilient part of her that still believed in miracles, even when all the science said otherwise. Elena closed the file and walked to the window overlooking the city. Seattle was just beginning to wake up, the sky lightening from black to gray, rain still falling in steady sheets. She thought about Mason Reed, about his daughter's laughter through the walls, about the crayon drawings on his refrigerator and the stuffed animals on his couch, and the way his whole face changed when Lila called for him. "You're a good father," she'd told him. And he was. Elena had watched him long enough to know. But was that enough reason to ask him for this? Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant at the clinic. "Dr. Hart? Are you here? I saw your car in the lot." Elena typed back. "Couldn't sleep. I'm in the lab. Everything okay? Just thinking. About?" Elena hesitated, then wrote, "About what happens when you run out of options." Her assistant didn't respond for a long moment. Then, "You haven't run out yet." Elena smiled faintly and pocketed her phone. Not yet, but soon. Dropped. Mason woke to Lila jumping on his bed. "Dad, Dad, wake up! We're going to be late!" He groaned and squinted at the clock. 6:15. They had plenty of time. "Lila, I'm up! I'm up!" "You're not up. Your eyes are closed." "They're open now. Are you making pancakes?" "Do I ever make pancakes on Thursdays?" "You could start." Mason laughed and sat up, ruffling her hair. "Nice try. Go get dressed. I'll make you toast." Toast is boring. Toast is efficient. That's a dad word. "You're a dad, kid. Go." Lila scampered off, and Mason dragged himself out of bed. He went through the morning routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, toast with peanut butter for Lila, and black coffee for himself. He packed her lunch while she brushed her teeth, double-checked her homework folder, made sure her library books were in her backpack. Normal. Routine. Safe. But his mind kept drifting across the hall. They left the apartment at 7:30, and as Mason locked the door, he heard Elena's door open. She stepped into the hallway, dressed for work in dark slacks and a blazer, her hair pulled back in that sleek ponytail. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her face was pale and drawn. Their eyes met. "Morning," Mason said. "Good morning," Elena replied. Her voice was carefully neutral. Lila tugged on Mason's hand. "Dad, we're going to be late." "We're fine, kiddo." But Lila was already pulling him toward the elevator, and Mason let himself be pulled, glancing back once to see Elena still standing in her doorway, watching them go. The day passed in a blur of work. Mason and his crew were finishing up a major landscaping job for a tech company in Bellevue, installing native plants, building raised beds, laying down irrigation lines. It was good work, physical, straightforward, the kind of thing where you could see immediate results. But Mason's mind was elsewhere. At lunch, his foreman Carlos noticed. "You good, boss?" Carlos asked, unwrapping a burrito. "You've been weird all morning." "I'm fine." "You planted 3 rhododendrons in the shade. They need full sun." Mason looked at the plants in question and swore under his breath. Carlos was right. "Sorry," Mason said. "I'll move them." "What's going on?" "Nothing. Just thinking about something." Heavy thinking, by the look of it. Mason sat down on the edge of a planter box, pulling off his work gloves. "If someone asked you for a huge favor," he said slowly, "something that would change their life, but it was complicated and weird and you didn't really know them, Would you do it? Carlos raised an eyebrow. That's specific? Hypothetically. What's the favor? Mason hesitated. Can't say. Then I can't answer. Come on, Carlos. Carlos took a bite of his burrito, chewing thoughtfully. Depends, he said finally. Do I trust them? I think so. Would it hurt anyone? No, I don't think so. Would it help them? Yes, definitely. Carlos shrugged. Then I'd probably do it. Just like that? Life's short, man, Carlos said. You spend too much time overthinking. You miss the stuff that matters. He grinned. Also, this is not hypothetical, is it? Mason smiled despite himself. No. Figured. You're a terrible liar. Katsin. Mason picked Lila up from school at 3, and they stopped at the grocery store on the way home. Lila insisted on getting ingredients for chocolate chip cookies, which meant Mason's carefully planned dinner menu went out the window. We'll make them together, Lila announced, pushing the cart with intense concentration. You do the oven parts, I do the mixing. Deal. They spent the evening in the kitchen, flour dusted across every surface, Lila standing on a stool to reach the counter. She was meticulous about measuring ingredients, tongue poking out in concentration as she leveled off each cup of flour. Dad, she said, stirring the batter, can I ask you something? Always. Why don't you have a girlfriend? Mason nearly dropped the egg he was holding. Where'd that come from? Megan's mom has a boyfriend. She says he's nice. That's good. So why don't you? Mason cracked the egg into the bowl, buying time. I don't know, kiddo. I guess I've been busy. Busy with me? Busy with life. Lila frowned, stirring harder. I wouldn't mind if you had a girlfriend, as long as she was nice. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. Thanks, Lila Bean. I'll keep that in mind. Ms. Rodriguez is nice. She smells like flowers. Your teacher? Yeah, and she always has good snacks. I don't think I'm Ms. Rodriguez's type. Why not? She's married. Oh. Lila thought about this. What about the lady across the hall? Mason froze. Doctor. Hart? Yeah. She smiled at me in the elevator once. She has a pretty smile. She does, Mason agreed carefully. Is she nice? I think so. Then maybe you should ask her. Ask her what? To be your girlfriend. Mason laughed, ruffling Lila's hair. It doesn't work like that, kiddo. Why not? Because... Mason stopped. How did you explain adult relationships to an 8-year-old? It's complicated. That's a grown-up word for, I don't want to explain. You're too smart for your own good. I know. They finished the cookies in comfortable silence, and while they baked, Mason cleaned up the kitchen. But his mind kept circling back to Elena, to her request, to the decision he'd promised to make by tonight. At 7 o'clock, after Lila was in bed, Mason walked across the hall and knocked on Elena's door. She opened it immediately, like she'd been waiting. Hi, Mason said. Hi. They stood there for a moment, neither speaking. Then Mason said, I'll do it. Elena's eyes widened. You what? I'll be your donor, Mason said, on one condition. Anything. We do this honestly, Mason said. No lawyers, no contracts, no cold clinical distance. If we're doing this, we do it like people. We talk. We're honest. He paused, searching for the right words. We respect what this is, not a transaction, a life. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Okay, she whispered. Okay. And just like that, everything changed. The paperwork came first. Elena arrived at Mason's door 3 days later with a leather folder tucked under her arm and the kind of nervous energy that made her talk too fast and gesture with her hands more than usual. Mason let her in, and they sat at the same kitchen table where this had all begun, only now the space between them felt different, charged with something neither of them knew how to name. I know we said no lawyers, Elena began, spreading documents across the table, but there are medical consent forms. Health history questionnaires. The clinic requires them for legal liability purposes. It's standard procedure. Mason picked up one of the forms, scanning the dense paragraphs of medical terminology. You want to know if heart disease runs in my family? Among other things, genetic conditions, hereditary illnesses, psychiatric history. It's comprehensive. Psychiatric history, Mason repeated, a smile tugging at his mouth. You sure you want to go through with this? I did agree to father a child with a woman I barely know. That's got to raise some red flags. Elena's expression softened. The sanest people I know are the ones who question their own sanity. Is that a medical opinion? Personal observation. Mason set the form down and met her eyes across the table. You really thought I'd say no, didn't you? Elena's fingers tightened around the pen she was holding. I thought you'd be smart enough to say no. And instead, I was dumb enough to say yes. I didn't mean it like that. I know. Mason leaned back in his chair, studying her. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you want this so badly? A child, I mean. You've got a career you're brilliant at. You've got your independence. You could travel, focus on work, do whatever you want. Why put yourself through all this pain for something that might never happen? Elena was quiet for a long moment. She set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you remember the first time you held Lila? She asked. Mason nodded. Every second. What did it feel like? Mason thought back to that moment in the hospital. The weight of his daughter in his arms, impossibly small and fragile. The way she'd opened her eyes and looked at him like he was her entire world. The terror and wonder and overwhelming, crushing responsibility of it all. Like nothing else mattered, he said quietly. Like every single thing I'd done in my life up to that point had been leading to that moment. That's why, Elena said simply, I've spent my entire adult life helping other people have that moment. I've seen it thousands of times. The look on their faces when they hold their baby for the first time. The way everything changes in an instant. And every single time I think, I want that. I want to know what that feels like, not as a doctor, as a mother. Mason understood then. Not just intellectually, but in the bone-deep way you understood something you'd lived through yourself. Okay, he said. Let's fill out the forms. They worked through the paperwork together over the next hour, Elena explaining each section in her calm, professional voice, while Mason answered questions about his family medical history, his lifestyle, his habits. It should have felt clinical, transactional, but somehow it didn't. Somehow it felt like they were building something together, brick by careful brick. Do you drink? Elena asked, reading from the questionnaire. Occasionally, beer mostly, nothing heavy. Smoke? Never. Recreational drugs? Not since college, and even then it was just, Mason paused. Do you actually need to know this, or is this like a getting to know you thing? Elena's lips quirked. Both. Honestly? I tried marijuana twice at a friend's apartment when I was 22, hated it both times, and never touched it again. I'm boring. Boring is good. Boring is stable. Elena made a note on the form. Any major surgeries or hospitalizations? Broke my collarbone when I was 16. Skateboarding accident, required surgery and 6 weeks in a sling. Any complications? Just humiliation. My brother never let me live it down. Elena smiled, and Mason realized it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that night in the rain. It transformed her face, softening the sharp lines, and making her look younger, more open. You have a brother? She asked. Jake, 2 years younger, lives in Tacoma with his wife and their twin boys. So Lila has cousins. Yeah, they're terrors. She loves them. That's nice, Elena said softly. Family. There was something in her voice that made Mason pause. You don't have family? Not really. My parents passed away when I was in medical school. Car accident. I was an only child, so... She shrugged. It's just me. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But Mason could hear the weight of it in her voice, the kind of grief that never fully faded, just became part of the background noise of your life. Is that part of why you want this? He asked gently. The baby? Because you don't have family? Elena considered the question, her pen hovering over the form. Maybe, she admitted. I've been alone for a long time, Mason. I'm good at it. I built a life that works. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and I think I've finally figured out which one I am. Mason felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent 7 years convincing himself he wasn't lonely, that he and Lila were enough, that he didn't need anyone else, that his life was full and complete exactly as it was. And most days he believed it. But sitting here with Elena, watching her trace patterns on the tabletop with her fingertip, he recognized the same quiet ache he'd been carrying for years, the same longing for something more than just getting through each day. "I get it," he said. Elena looked up, and their eyes met across the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena cleared her throat and returned her attention to the paperwork. "We should schedule the procedure," she said, her voice carefully professional again. "The clinic can do it next week if you're available. Tuesday or Thursday morning would work best." "Thursday's good. I can move some things around." "You'll need to provide a sample the day of. They'll fertilize the egg immediately and monitor it for 5 days to see if it develops into a blastocyst. If it does, they'll transfer it. If not..." She stopped. "If not, it's over," Mason finished quietly. "Yes." Mason reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was an impulse, unplanned, but Elena didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold beneath his palm. "Hey," he said. "One step at a time, okay? Let's get through Thursday first." Elena nodded, blinking rapidly. "One step at a time." The front door burst open and Lila came running in from the hallway where she'd been playing with the neighbor's cat. She skidded to a stop when she saw Elena sitting at the table. "Oh," Lila said. "Hi." "Hi," Elena replied, straightening in her chair. "You must be Lila. I'm Elena. I live across the hall." "I know. I've seen you in the elevator." Lila tilted her head, studying Elena with the unselfconscious curiosity of a child. "You're really pretty." "Lila," Mason warned, but Elena laughed. "Thank you," Elena said. "You're very pretty too." "I know," Lila said matter-of-factly. "My dad says I get it from my mom, but I don't remember her, so I think I get it from him." "Lila, it's okay," Elena said softly. She looked at Mason, a question in her eyes, and he gave a small shake of his head. Later. "Are you having dinner with us?" Lila asked Elena. "Oh, I don't want to intrude. Dad's making spaghetti. He makes too much. He always makes too much." "That's because you said you wanted leftovers for lunch," Mason pointed out. "I changed my mind. I want pizza bagels." "You can't change the lunch menu at 6 p.m. "I just did." Elena laughed again, and Mason felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sound. "You can stay if you want," he said. "Lila's right. I always make too much." Elena hesitated, and Mason could see her weighing the decision. The safe thing would be to decline, to keep this arrangement professional and distant, to maintain the boundaries that made sense. But Elena didn't do the safe thing. "I'd like that," she said. Dinner was chaotic in the best way. Lila dominated the conversation, telling Elena about school and her teacher and the science project she was working on about the life cycle of butterflies. Elena listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering suggestions, and Mason watched the two of them interact with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Dad doesn't know anything about butterflies," Lila announced, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "He keeps calling the chrysalis a cocoon." "They're different?" Mason asked. "Completely different," Elena said, her eyes twinkling. "Butterflies form chrysalises. Moths form cocoons." "See?" Lila said triumphantly. "Elena knows." "Elena's a doctor," Mason said. "She knows a lot of things." "What kind of doctor?" Lila asked. "I help people have babies," Elena said carefully. "Like delivering them?" "Sometimes. But mostly I help people who are having trouble getting pregnant." "Why would they have trouble?" "Lila," Mason started, but Elena shook her head. "It's okay. Sometimes people's bodies don't work the way they're supposed to, so I help them figure out why and fix it if I can." Lila considered this. "That's a nice job." "I think so too." After dinner, Elena helped clear the table while Mason started on dishes. Lila disappeared into her room to work on homework, leaving them alone in the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, Elena drying while Mason washed, and it felt startlingly domestic. Natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. "She's wonderful," Elena said quietly, stacking plates in the cupboard. She is. I got lucky. It's not luck. You raised her well. Mason glanced at her. You got all that from one dinner? I got it from watching you with her, the way she trusts you completely, the way she's confident enough to be herself. That doesn't happen by accident. Mason felt his throat tighten. I'm just doing my best. Your best is more than most people's everything. They finished the dishes, and Elena dried her hands on the towel, folding it carefully over the oven handle. She looked like she was building up the courage to say something. Mason, she said finally, I want you to know what you're doing for me. It's... She stopped, searching for words. I don't have the words for what this means. You don't need words. I do, though, because I need you to understand that I'm not taking this lightly. I know what I'm asking. I know this is going to change things, maybe in ways neither of us can predict. And if at any point you want to back out, I won't. But if you do, Elena, Mason turned to face her fully. I made you a promise. I'm keeping it. I don't break promises. Not to you, not to anyone. Elena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Why are you so kind? I'm not. I'm just... Mason paused. I'm just trying to do the right thing. Most people don't even try. Before Mason could respond, Lila called from her room. Dad, I need help with math. Mason glanced toward the hallway, then back at Elena. I should... Go. I'll let myself out. But as Mason headed toward Lila's room, Elena caught his arm. Her touch was light, tentative, but it stopped him in his tracks. Thank you, she whispered. Mason covered her hand with his own. Thursday, he said. We'll get through this together. Elena nodded, and then she was gone, slipping out the front door like a ghost. Mason stood in the hallway for a moment, feeling the lingering warmth of her hand on his arm, before Lila called again. Dad, these fractions are impossible. Coming, kiddo. The week passed in a strange blur of normalcy and anticipation. Mason went to work, picked up Lila from school, made dinner, helped with homework. The usual routines. But underneath it all was the constant awareness of Thursday approaching, of the decision he'd made and the life that might come from it. Elena texted him Wednesday night. Just a simple message. Appointment is at 9 a.m. Clinic address below. Thank you. Mason stared at the text for a long time before responding. I'll be there. He arranged for his brother to pick up Lila from school Thursday afternoon, telling Jake he had a medical appointment. It wasn't exactly a lie. Jake didn't ask questions, just said sure, and asked if everything was okay. Everything's fine, Mason said. Just routine stuff. Thursday morning came too fast. Mason woke before his alarm, anxiety coiling in his stomach. He got Lila ready for school, moving through the familiar motions on autopilot, and dropped her off with a kiss on the forehead and a promise to see her tonight. Then he drove to the clinic. Pacific Northwest Reproductive Medicine occupied the third floor of a sleek glass building downtown. The waiting room was done in soothing blues and greens with comfortable chairs and soft music playing from hidden speakers. Framed photos of babies lined the walls. Success stories, Mason assumed. Proof that miracles happened here. He checked in at the front desk, and the receptionist smiled warmly. Mr. Reed, Dr. Hart is expecting you. She'll be right out. Mason sat down, his palms sweating. He'd been in hospitals before, when Lila was born, when she'd gotten stitches after falling off the monkey bars. But this felt different, more intimate, more loaded with meaning. Elena appeared in the doorway wearing scrubs and a white coat, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked professional and composed, but Mason could see the tension around her eyes. Mason, she said, come on back. He followed her down a quiet hallway to a small consultation room. Elena closed the door behind them, and immediately the professional mask slipped. Are you okay? She asked. I should be asking you that. I'm terrified. That makes two of us. Elena sat down in one of the chairs, and Mason took the other. They looked at each other across the small space, and Mason saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. We don't have to do this, Elena said. If you've changed your mind, I haven't. You're sure? Mason reached out and took her hand. I'm sure. Are you? Elena's fingers tightened around his. Yes? Then let's do this. The procedure itself was straightforward and clinical. A nurse led Mason to a private room and explained the process with professional efficiency. It was awkward and uncomfortable and deeply strange, but Mason focused on why he was here, on Elena waiting somewhere in this building, on the fragile possibility of a life that might begin today. When he emerged 20 minutes later, Elena was waiting in the hallway. She looked up as he approached, and her expression was so vulnerable it made Mason's chest ache. "All done," he said. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "What happens now?" "Now we wait. The embryologist will fertilize the egg today. Tomorrow we'll know if it's developing properly. If it is, they'll transfer it on Monday. If it's not—" She stopped. "One step at a time," Mason reminded her gently. Elena nodded. "One step at a time." She walked him to the elevator, and as the doors opened, Mason turned back. "Call me," he said, "when you hear something, even if it's bad news, especially if it's bad news." "I will." "Promise?" "Promise." Mason stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he saw Elena standing alone in the hallway, her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. The call came Friday afternoon. Mason was in the middle of installing an irrigation system when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He saw Elena's name on the screen and his heart jumped into his throat. "Hey," he answered, stepping away from his crew. "What's the news?" There was a long pause, and then Elena's voice, shaking with emotion. "It's developing. Mason, it's developing. The embryologist called an hour ago. We have a blastocyst." Mason closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. "That's good. That's really good, right?" "It's better than good. It's—" Elena's voice broke. "It's a miracle." "When do they transfer it?" "Monday morning, 8 a.m. You don't have to be there," she added quickly. "I know you've already done so much." "I'll be there," Mason said. "You're sure?" "Elena, I'll be there." He heard her take a shaky breath. Okay, I'll see you Monday." Mason hung up and stood there for a moment, phone still in his hand, trying to process what he was feeling. Relief, hope, fear, excitement. All of it tangled together into something he couldn't name. "Boss?" Carlos called. "You good?" Mason looked up and smiled. "Yeah, I'm good." That weekend felt like the longest of Mason's life. He went through the motions, took Lila to her soccer game Saturday morning, had dinner with Jake and his family Saturday night, spent Sunday doing laundry and meal prep for the week. But his mind was elsewhere. On Elena. On Monday. On the tiny cluster of cells that might become a child. Sunday evening, there was a knock on his door. Mason opened it to find Elena standing there with a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. "I know it's last minute," she said, "but I couldn't sit in my apartment alone tonight. I've been pacing for 3 hours and I think I'm going to wear a hole in the floor." Mason stepped aside. "Come in." Lila was already in bed, so they sat in the living room with the wine, speaking in low voices. Elena curled into the corner of the couch, her feet tucked under her, and Mason sat in the armchair across from her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," Elena said. "Like if I lean forward even an inch, I'll fall. But you might fly. Or I might crash." Mason poured them each a glass of wine. "What are the actual odds? If you had to give me a number?" Elena swirled the wine in her glass. "At my age, with my history, 20%, maybe 25% if we're being optimistic. Those aren't terrible odds. They're not great ones either, but they're better than zero." Elena looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You're an optimist. I'm a realist who chooses hope. That's just optimism with extra steps." Mason smiled. "Maybe." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and listening to the rain start up outside. Finally, Elena spoke again. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything. I'm scared that if this doesn't work, I won't survive it. Not physically, emotionally. I've put everything into this, every ounce of hope I have left. And if it fails—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to come back from that." Mason set down his wine and moved to the couch beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space, just sat close enough that she could feel his presence. "You'll survive it," he said quietly, "because you're stronger than you think. and because you won't be alone. Elena looked at him, her eyes bright with tears. Why are you doing this? Really? You could have said no. You should have said no. But you didn't, and I don't understand why. Mason thought about his answer carefully. Because I know what it's like to want something so badly it physically hurts. I know what it's like to feel like your whole life is hanging on a single moment. And I know what it's like when someone shows up for you when you need them most. He paused. My brother did that for me when Lila's mom left. He drove 2 hours in the middle of the night because I called him crying. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me it would be okay. He just showed up. And that made all the difference. So you're paying it forward? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to be the kind of person I want Lila to grow up around. The kind who helps when they can. Who doesn't turn away from hard things. Elena reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You're a good man, Mason Reed. I'm just a man. No, Elena said softly. You're not. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, neither speaking. And when Elena finally left an hour later, Mason stood in his doorway and watched her cross the hall to her own apartment. She turned back before going inside, and their eyes met across the distance. Tomorrow everything would change. One way or another, tomorrow would tell them if hope was enough. Monday morning came wrapped in fog and cold drizzle. Mason woke at 6, got Lila ready for school, and dropped her off early with promises he'd pick her up on time. Then he drove to the clinic, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his mind racing. Elena was already there when he arrived, sitting in the waiting room in jeans and a soft sweater. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable without her white coat and professional armor. You came, she said, standing when she saw him. I said I would. I know, but I thought... She stopped, shaking her head. Thank you. They checked in together, and the nurse led them back to a procedure room. Elena changed into a gown while Mason waited outside, and when she emerged, pale and nervous, he took her hand. Ready? He asked. No, Elena admitted, but I don't think I ever will be. The transfer itself took less than 15 minutes. Mason waited in the hallway, pacing the length of the corridor, until the nurse came out and told him Elena was resting, but he could go in. He found her lying on the exam table, her hand pressed to her lower abdomen, tears streaming down her face. Elena, it's in there, she whispered. Right now, it's in there. A part of you and a part of me, and it's real, and I can't... She broke off, covering her face with her hands. Mason moved to her side and gathered her into his arms, letting her cry against his chest. He held her while she shook, while years of grief and hope and fear poured out of her, and he didn't say a word, just held her. When she finally quieted, Elena pulled back and wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall apart like that. You're allowed to fall apart. Not in front of you. Especially in front of me, Mason corrected gently. That was the deal, remember? Honesty. No distance. Elena managed a watery smile. Honesty. So be honest. How are you feeling? Terrified? Hopeful? Grateful? All of it at once. That sounds about right. The nurse came back in with discharge instructions, bed rest for the next 2 days, no strenuous activity, follow-up appointment in 2 weeks for the pregnancy test. 2 weeks. 14 days to find out if any of this had worked. Mason drove Elena home and walked her to her apartment. She moved slowly, carefully, like she was carrying something precious and breakable, which, Mason supposed, she was. Do you need anything? He asked at her door. Groceries? Food? I'm okay. I stocked up yesterday. You sure? Elena smiled. I'm sure. Go pick up Lila. Be with your daughter. I'll be fine. But as Mason turned to leave, Elena caught his hand. Mason? She said softly. Yeah. Thank you. For all of it. For saying yes, for being here, for... Her voice caught. For making me feel less alone. Mason squeezed her hand. You're not alone. Not anymore. He left her there and crossed the hall to his own apartment. And as he closed the door behind him, he realized something had shifted. This wasn't just an arrangement anymore. This wasn't just helping a neighbor. This was something else entirely. And Mason had no idea what to do about it. The 2 weeks that followed the transfer stretched out like years. Mason found himself hyper-aware of every sound from across the hall, every footstep, every closing door. He resisted the urge to knock on Elena's door a dozen times a day, reminding himself she needed rest, needed space, needed time for her body to do what it was supposed to do without interference. But on the third day, Elena knocked on his door first. Mason opened it to find her standing there in sweatpants and an oversized cardigan, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked softer somehow, less guarded, and she was holding a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon. "I made too many muffins," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Thought maybe Lila would like some." Mason knew deflection when he heard it. "You're supposed to be resting." "I've been resting. I'm going stir-crazy. Baking is restful." "Baking is not restful." "It is when you do it sitting down." Elena held out the bag. "Please? I need to feel useful or I'm going to lose my mind." Mason took the bag and stepped aside. "Come in. Coffee?" "Decaf," Elena said, walking into the kitchen. "I'm off caffeine until—" She stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "Until we know." Mason put on a pot of decaf and they sat at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed. Elena pulled a muffin from the bag and picked at it nervously, not really eating, just giving her hand something to do. "How are you feeling?" Mason asked. "Physically?" "Fine. No symptoms, but it's too early for that anyway." "Emotionally?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "I've Googled early pregnancy symptoms about 400 times in the last 3 days. I'm analyzing every twinge, every moment of fatigue, convincing myself it means something when it probably means nothing." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Elena set down the muffin. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be dumping this on you." "Yes, you should. That's what we agreed to, remember? Honesty." "I'm not used to it. Being honest, letting people see me like this." "Like what?" "Unraveling." Mason poured them each a cup of coffee and sat back down. "You're not unraveling, you're just human." "It doesn't feel human, it feels pathetic." "It's not." Mason wrapped his hands around his mug, choosing his words carefully. "When Lila's mom left, I spent 3 months convinced I was going to screw everything up. I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, sure I'd forgotten to do something crucial. Feed her, change her, something. I'd run to her room and just stand there watching her sleep, making sure she was still breathing. That doesn't sound pathetic either. It felt that way at the time, like I was failing at the one thing that mattered most." Elena was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What changed?" "Jake, my brother. He told me something that stuck with me. He said the fact that I was so worried about screwing up meant I probably wouldn't. Because the people who fail are the ones who don't care enough to worry in the first place." "Is that supposed to make me feel better? Is it working?" Elena smiled despite herself. "A little." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Lila burst through the front door an hour later, home from school with Mason's neighbor who'd picked her up, she lit up when she saw Elena. "You're here!" Lila dropped her backpack and rushed to the table. "Are those muffins?" "They are," Elena said. "I made them this morning. Want to try one?" Lila grabbed a muffin and took an enormous bite, her eyes widening. "These are amazing. Can you teach me how to make them?" "Lila, don't ask people to—" Mason started, but Elena interrupted. "I'd love to," she said. "If your dad says it's okay." Lila turned pleading eyes on Mason. "Dad? Please." Mason looked at Elena, saw the hope in her expression, the way she was already leaning toward Lila like she was drawn to her, and he understood. Elena needed this. Needed to be around life and laughter and the simple, uncomplicated joy of a child who didn't know about failed cycles and diminishing odds. "Sure," Mason said, "but not today. Elena needs to rest." "Tomorrow?" Lila asked. "We'll see." But tomorrow turned into the next day, and then the day after that. Elena started showing up at Mason's apartment in the evenings, ostensibly to teach Lila how to bake or help with homework. But Mason knew the real reason. She was scared to be alone with her thoughts, scared to sit in her silent apartment counting down the hours until the pregnancy test. And Mason didn't mind. He liked having her there. Liked the way she laughed at Lila's terrible jokes, liked the way she'd roll up her sleeves and help with dinner without being asked. Liked the way his apartment felt warmer, fuller, more like a home when she was in it, One evening, while Lila was in the bathroom brushing her teeth, Elena helped Mason clean up after dinner. They moved around each other with an easy rhythm now, no longer awkward or uncertain. Elena washed while Mason dried, and the kitchen was quiet except for the running water and the distant sound of Lila singing off-key. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elena said, scrubbing a pot. "You just asked me to father your child. I think we're past worrying about personal." Elena smiled. "Fair point. What happened with Lila's mom? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Mason was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with more attention than it needed. "Claire, her name was Claire. We met in college, got married too young, had Lila even younger. I thought we were happy, but looking back, I think I was the only one who thought that." "What do you mean?" "She never wanted to be a mother, not really. I think she thought she did, or thought she should, but once Lila was born..." Mason set down the plate. "She just shut down, stopped engaging, stopped trying. I'd come home from work and find Lila in her crib crying, and Claire would be in the bedroom with the door closed. At first I thought it was postpartum depression. I tried to get her help, but she refused, said she was fine. And then one day, she wasn't there anymore." "She just left?" "Just left. I got a note and divorce papers 6 months later. She signed away all parental rights. I haven't heard from her since." Elena's hand stilled in the soapy water. "I'm so sorry, Mason." "Don't be. I was angry for a long time, but now I'm just grateful, I guess. Grateful that Lila doesn't remember her. Grateful that we got out before the damage was permanent." Still, that must have been devastating. It was. But it also taught me something important. You can't make someone love you. You can't make someone stay. All you can do is love the people who do stay as hard as you can. Elena looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that made Mason's breath catch. Something tender and searching and almost frightened. "Is that what you're doing?" she asked softly. "With me?" Mason held her gaze. "Yeah. I think maybe I am." The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Then Lila called from the bathroom, asking for help with a tangled hair tie, and the moment broke. Elena pulled her hands from the water, drying them on a towel. "I should go. Let you get her to bed." "You don't have to." "I know, but I should." Mason walked her to the door, and Elena paused on the threshold, looking back at him. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me be part of this. Your life, Lila's life. It means more than you know." "You're not just part of it," Mason said. "You're becoming it." Elena's eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, Mason said goodnight and closed the door. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, wondering if he'd said too much, revealed too much. But he couldn't bring himself to regret it, because it was true. The pregnancy test was scheduled for a Friday morning, 2 weeks to the day after the transfer. Mason took the morning off work, telling Carlos he had a personal appointment and deflecting questions with practiced ease. He met Elena at the clinic at 8, and they sat together in the waiting room, not speaking, just existing in the heavy silence of anticipation. When the nurse called Elena's name, she stood on shaking legs. Mason stood with her. "You don't have to come back with me," Elena said. "I know. It's just a blood draw." "I know that too." Elena searched his face, then nodded. "Okay." They followed the nurse to a small exam room, and Mason held Elena's hand while the phlebotomist drew 3 vials of blood. Elena didn't flinch, didn't look away, just stared at the wall with the kind of intensity that suggested she was using every ounce of willpower to hold herself together. When it was done, the nurse smiled brightly and said, "We'll have results in about 4 hours. Dr. Hart, you can wait here or we can call you." "Call me," Elena said quickly. "Please." They walked out of the clinic together into gray morning light. Rain threatened but hadn't started yet, the sky heavy and dark with it. "What do you want to do?" Mason asked. "While we wait?" Elena wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't know. I can't go home. I'll just pace and spiral. Come with me then." "Where?" "Anywhere? Nowhere. Let's just drive." They got in Mason's truck and headed north out of the city. No destination in mind, just the need to move. Mason drove while Elena stared out the window, and neither of them tried to fill the silence with empty reassurances. They both knew the odds. They both knew hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. After an hour, Mason pulled into a state park he'd taken Lila to once for a school field trip. The parking lot was nearly empty, the trails quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees. They got out and walked, following a path that wound along a rocky beach. "I used to come to places like this when I was younger," Elena said, hands in her pockets. "Before medical school consumed my life. I'd hike for hours, just thinking." "About what?" "Everything. Nothing. The future mostly. What I wanted my life to look like. Who I wanted to be." "And did it turn out the way you imagined?" Elena laughed, a sad sound. "Not even close. I thought I'd be married by 30, have 2 kids and a house with a yard. The whole picture. Instead, I'm 41, single, and my only shot at having a child depends on a blood test I won't get results from for—" She checked her phone. 3 more hours. "Your life isn't over at 41, Elena. I know that, but it feels like it sometimes. Like all the doors I thought would be open are closing, one by one, and I'm running out of time to walk through them." Mason stopped walking and turned to face her. "Then stop running. Stop trying to control every outcome. Just be here, right now, in this moment." "That's easier said than done." "I know. But it's also the only thing that kept me sane when Lila was a baby. I had to stop thinking about all the ways I might fail and just focus on getting through each day, each hour, each moment." Elena looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What if the test is negative? Then we'll deal with it." "How?" "Together." The word hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Elena took a shaky breath and nodded. They walked for another hour, talking about small things, safe things. Lila's upcoming school play, Mason's brother's terrible cooking, Elena's colleague who kept trying to set her up on blind dates. The conversation was a lifeline, keeping them tethered to normalcy while the clock ticked down. At 11:30, Elena's phone rang. She pulled it from her pocket and stared at the screen, her face going pale. The clinic's number glowed there, undeniable and terrifying. "I can't," Elena whispered. "I can't answer it." "Do you want me to?" Elena looked at him, desperate and grateful, and handed him the phone. Mason took a deep breath and answered. "Hello? Is this Dr. Hart?" a cheerful voice asked. "No, this is Mason Reed. I'm with Dr. Hart. She asked me to take the call." "Oh, of course. This is Stephanie from Pacific Northwest Reproductive Medicine. Is Dr. Hart available to hear her results?" Mason looked at Elena. She'd wrapped her arms around herself and was staring at the ground, trembling. "She's here," Mason said. "Go ahead." There was a pause, the rustle of papers, and then Stephanie said, "Dr. Hart's HCG level is 5.2. Mason's heart sank. He didn't know much about pregnancy tests, but he knew that number was low. Too low. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "HCG levels under 5 are considered negative," Stephanie explained, her voice still bright and professional. "I'm so sorry. The transfer didn't take. We'll want Dr. Hart to come in next week to discuss next steps. But for now..." Mason stopped listening. The rest of Stephanie's words faded into white noise as he looked at Elena, trying to figure out how to tell her, how to break her heart with a single number. Elena must have seen it in his face because she made a small, broken sound and turned away, her shoulders shaking. "Thank you," Mason said into the phone, his voice hollow. "We'll call to schedule the follow-up." He hung up and stood there helplessly as Elena fell apart in front of him. She didn't cry loudly, didn't scream or rage, just stood there with her face in her hands, silent sobs racking her body, and it was somehow worse than any breakdown Mason had ever witnessed. He moved to her and pulled her into his arms, and Elena collapsed against him like a puppet with cut strings. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry." Elena couldn't speak, just clung to him while years of hope died in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They stood like that for a long time, in the middle of a deserted trail with rain finally starting to fall around them. Mason held Elena while she grieved, and he felt his own heart breaking for her, for the child that would never be, for the dream that had finally, irrevocably slipped through her fingers. When Elena finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed. "I need to go home," she said, her voice hoarse. "Okay, I'll drive you." "No, I mean home, not the apartment. I can't—" She broke off, shaking her head. "I can't be there right now. I can't see you every day and remember what we tried to do, what failed." Mason felt something cold settle in his chest. "Elena, I have a friend in Portland," she continued, speaking quickly now, like if she stopped she'd lose her nerve. "She's been asking me to visit for months. I think I'll go, take some time, clear my head." "For how long?" "I don't know, a few weeks, a month? I just need space, distance. I need to figure out how to breathe again." Mason wanted to argue, wanted to tell her running wouldn't help, that she'd just be alone with her grief in a different city. But he could see the desperation in her eyes, the need to escape before the walls closed in completely. "Okay," he said quietly, "if that's what you need." "It is." They drove back to Seattle in silence. Elena stared out the window the entire time, her arms wrapped around herself, and Mason gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. When they reached their building, Elena got out of the truck without a word and disappeared into her apartment. Mason sat in the parking lot for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. The test had failed. He'd expected that possibility, had prepared himself for Elena's disappointment, but he hadn't prepared for this, for her leaving, for the sudden, yawning absence where she'd been. He finally went upstairs and picked up Lila from the neighbor who'd agreed to watch her for the day. Lila chattered about a craft project she'd made, oblivious to the weight pressing down on Mason's chest, and he smiled and nodded in all the right places while his mind spun. That night, after Lila was asleep, Mason stood at his kitchen window and looked across at Elena's apartment. The lights were on, and he could see her shadow moving back and forth, packing, getting ready to leave. He thought about going over there, about knocking on her door and telling her she didn't have to do this alone, that he was here, that Lila was here, that they could help her through this if she'd just let them. But he didn't, because Elena had asked for space, and Mason had learned a long time ago that when someone you cared about asked for space, you gave it to them, even when every instinct screamed at you to hold on tighter. So Mason stood at his window and watched Elena's shadow move through her apartment, and he waited for morning. Elena left on Saturday. Mason heard her door open early, before 6, and he went to his own door and looked through the peephole. She was in the hallway with 2 suitcases, locking up, moving with mechanical efficiency. He opened his door before he could talk himself out of it. Elena froze when she saw him. "Mason, I was going to leave you a note." "I know." They stood there in the hallway, the space between them feeling vast despite being only a few feet. "I don't know when I'll be back," Elena said. "Could be weeks. Could be longer." "That's okay." "Is it?" Mason wanted to say no, wanted to tell her it wasn't okay, that this felt wrong, that leaving wouldn't fix what was broken. But instead he said, "If it's what you need, then yes." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I can't do this, Mason. I can't see you every day and pretend everything's fine. I can't watch you with Lila and think about what I'll never have. I can't." "I understand." "Do you?" "Yes, because I've been where you are. And sometimes you need to fall apart somewhere no one can see you do it." Elena nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you for everything you did, for trying, for caring, for—" Her voice broke. "For making me hope again, even if it didn't work out." Mason crossed the distance between them and pulled her into a tight hug. Elena clung to him, and he felt her shake with suppressed sobs. "Take care of yourself," he whispered against her hair. "You too." And then she was gone, pulling away and grabbing her suitcases and heading for the elevator without looking back. Mason stood in the hallway and watched her disappear, and he felt something vital leave with her. He went back into his apartment and tried to go about his normal Saturday routine. Made breakfast, watched cartoons with Lila, did laundry, but everything felt muted, colorless, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Lila noticed. "Dad?" she said that afternoon, looking up from her coloring book. "Are you sad?" Mason forced a smile. "I'm okay, kiddo." "You look sad." "Just tired." "Is it because of Elena?" Mason's head snapped up. "What?" "I saw her leaving this morning, with suitcases. Is she coming back? Mason sat down next to Lila on the floor, choosing his words carefully. I don't know. She had to go visit a friend for a while. Did you guys have a fight? No, nothing like that. Mason paused. She's going through something hard right now, and sometimes people need space to figure things out. What's she going through? That's private, Lila. Lila frowned, then went back to coloring. After a moment, she said quietly, I liked her. Me too, kiddo. I hope she comes back. Mason looked down at his daughter's bent head, at her small hands gripping crayons, and felt his throat tighten. Yeah, me too. Days turned into weeks, and Elena didn't come back. Her apartment stayed dark and silent, a constant reminder of her absence. Mason tried not to think about it, tried to focus on work and Lila, and the routines that had always kept him grounded. But it was hard, harder than he'd expected, because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, Mason had started to care, not just about helping Elena or honoring his promise, but about her, about the way she laughed at Lila's jokes and the way she got that faraway look when she was thinking, about the way she'd started to feel like part of his life instead of just someone passing through it, and now she was gone. And Mason didn't know if she'd ever come back. 3 weeks after Elena left, Mason was cleaning out the kitchen junk drawer when he found something wedged in the back. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased from being handled too many times. He pulled it out and unfolded it, and his breath caught. It was the note Claire had left when she abandoned them. 8 years old, the ink slightly faded, but the words still sharp enough to cut. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. Mason stared at those words, and for the first time in years he felt the old anger rise up, not at Claire for leaving, but at himself for keeping this, for holding on to a piece of pain he should have let go of long ago. He crumpled the note in his fist and threw it in the trash. Then he went to his computer and opened his email. He'd been composing the same message in his head for weeks, deleting it before he could send it, telling himself Elena needed space and he should respect that. But maybe space wasn't what she needed. Maybe what she needed was to know she wasn't alone. Mason started typing. Elena, I don't know if you're reading these emails, and I don't expect you to respond, but I wanted you to know that Lila asks about you almost every day. She made you a drawing last week. A butterfly, because she remembered you helping with her science project. I have it on the fridge. I'm keeping it for you for when you come back. If you come back. And if you don't, I understand that too. But I hope you do. Because this apartment feels emptier without you in it. We both miss you. Take all the time you need, but know that there's a place for you here when you're ready. Always. Mason. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then he closed his laptop and went to check on Lila, who was supposed to be doing homework but was probably reading instead. And in Portland, in a small apartment overlooking a rain-soaked street, Elena sat on her friend's couch with her laptop open, staring at Mason's email with tears streaming down her face. She'd been gone for 3 weeks, and every single day had been agony. She'd thought distance would help, thought she could outrun the grief and the failure and the hollow ache of loss. But she couldn't. Because what she was running from wasn't just the failed pregnancy. It was the life she'd glimpsed in Mason's apartment, the warmth and laughter and belonging, the feeling of being part of something instead of always standing outside looking in. She'd run because she was terrified, not of the loss, but of how much she'd started to want what Mason and Lila had, how much she'd started to want to be part of it. Elena read the email again, lingering on the last line. There's a place for you here when you're ready, always. She closed her laptop and stood up, walking to the window. Portland stretched out below her, gray and unfamiliar, and Elena realized with sudden crystal clarity that she didn't want to be here. She wanted to be home, but first, she needed to find the courage to go back. Elena didn't respond to the email. Days passed, then another week, and Mason checked his inbox compulsively, telling himself he didn't care while knowing it was a lie. He'd put himself out there, made himself vulnerable, and the silence felt like an answer in itself. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, taking on extra projects, staying late at job sites, anything to keep his mind occupied. Carlos noticed but didn't comment, just worked alongside him with the quiet understanding of someone who'd seen this kind of grief before. At home, Mason went through the motions, made dinner, helped with homework, read bedtime stories. But Lila wasn't fooled. "You're doing the sad smile thing again," she said one night, looking up from her plate of spaghetti. "What's the sad smile thing?" "When you smile, but your eyes don't. Like you're pretending to be happy." What Mason set down his fork, caught. "I'm not pretending, kiddo. I'm just tired." "You've been tired for 4 weeks. Has it been 4 weeks? 4 weeks and 2 days since Elena left. I've been counting." Mason felt something twist in his chest. "Why are you counting?" Lila shrugged, twirling pasta on her fork. "Because I thought she'd come back by now. She said she was visiting a friend, but visits don't usually last a month." "Sometimes they do." "Is she ever coming back?" "I don't know." Lila was quiet for a moment, then said, "Did we do something wrong?" "What? No. Lila, no." Mason reached across the table and took her hand. "This has nothing to do with you. Elena's dealing with some personal stuff that's really hard, and she needed to go somewhere she could figure it out. But we could help her figure it out. We're good at helping. Some things people need to figure out on their own." "That's dumb." "Maybe. But it's also how life works sometimes." Lila pulled her hand back and stabbed at her spaghetti with more force than necessary. "I miss her." "Me too, kiddo." "Then why don't you tell her that?" "I did." "And what did she say?" "Nothing yet." Lila looked up at him with the kind of 8-year-old wisdom that always caught Mason off guard. "Maybe she needs to hear it again." That night, after Lila was asleep, Mason sat at his computer and stared at a blank email. He typed and deleted a dozen different versions, unable to find the right words. How did you tell someone you'd known for barely 2 months that they'd become essential to your daily existence? That their absence had created a hole you couldn't figure out how to fill? Finally, he just wrote the truth. "Elena, I know you're not ready to respond, and that's okay. But Lila said something tonight that stuck with me. She said maybe you need to hear it again, so here it is. We miss you. I miss you. Not just because of what we tried to do or because I made a promise. I miss you because somewhere along the way, you became part of my life. Part of our life. And I'm not asking you to come back before you're ready. I'm just asking you to know that when you are ready, there's a place here waiting. A real place. Not just an empty apartment across the hall. Take care of yourself. Mason." He sent it before he could overthink it, then closed the laptop and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Mason lay in the dark, listening to the building settle around him, and thought about the last time he'd felt this untethered. It had been right after Claire left, when he'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced he'd failed somehow, that if he'd just been better or tried harder or loved more perfectly, she would have stayed. It had taken him years to understand that some people left not because you weren't enough, but because they were fighting battles you couldn't see and didn't know how to win. He wondered if that's what Elena was doing now, fighting battles he couldn't help with, no matter how much he wanted to. The call came 2 days later. Mason was knee-deep in a drainage project, mud-caked on his jeans, when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pull off his gloves and check the screen. Unknown number, Portland area code. His heart jumped into his throat. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a familiar voice, quiet and uncertain. "Mason, it's Elena." Mason stepped away from the worksite, pressing the phone tight against his ear. "Hey, are you okay?" "I don't know. Maybe. I got your emails." "I wasn't sure you were reading them." "I've read every single one, multiple times." Mason leaned against his truck, trying to steady his breathing. "Why didn't you respond?" "Because I didn't know what to say. I still don't, really. But I needed to hear your voice, so I called." "I'm glad you did." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Mason could hear traffic in the background, the distant sound of rain. "Can I tell you something?" "Anything." "I'm pregnant." The world tilted sideways. Mason's grip on the phone tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she'd just said. "What?" he managed finally. "I'm pregnant," Elena repeated, and now there were tears in her voice. "The test was wrong, Mason. The HCG was too low to register at first, but I started feeling strange a week ago. Nauseous, exhausted, all the classic symptoms. I thought I was just sick, or maybe psychosomatic, but I took a home test yesterday and it was positive. So I went to a clinic here and they did blood work, and an ultrasound, and her voice broke. There's a baby. A real, actual baby. 7 weeks along. Mason slid down to sit on the ground, his back against the truck tire, trying to wrap his mind around this impossible reversal. You're sure? He asked. I've looked at the ultrasound pictures about 1,000 times. It's real. How is that possible? The test said false negative. It happens sometimes with very low initial HCG levels. Mine was just barely above the threshold, and the lab called it negative when it should have been inconclusive. By the time I would have retested, I'd already left Seattle. I gave up, Mason. I ran away, and the whole time I was carrying... She broke off, sobbing. Mason's mind raced. 7 weeks. That meant Elena had been pregnant this entire time. Through all the grief and despair and running. Through every email he'd sent and every day she'd stayed away. Why didn't you call sooner? He asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Because I was terrified. I've had 4 failed pregnancies, Mason. 4 times I've gotten positive tests only to miscarry within weeks. I didn't want to tell you until I knew this one would stick, until I was sure I wasn't about to lose it. And are you sure now? The doctor says everything looks good, strong heartbeat, measuring right on schedule, but there are no guarantees, there never are. Mason closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions crashing through him. Relief, joy, fear, anger at being kept in the dark, gratitude that she'd finally told him. Where are you? He asked. In my car, outside the clinic. In Portland? Yes. Why are you still in Portland, Elena? There was a long silence. When Elena spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Because I'm a coward. You're not a coward. I am. I ran away when things got hard. I stayed away even when I knew I should come back. And now I'm pregnant with your child, and I'm still sitting in a different city because I don't know how to face you. Face me about what? About everything. About the fact that this was supposed to be simple and clinical, and now it's complicated and messy, and I have feelings I don't know what to do with. Mason's heart hammered in his chest. What kind of feelings? The kind that terrify me. The kind I wasn't supposed to develop. The kind that make me want things I have no right to want. Like what? Like you, Elena said, and the rawness in her voice cut straight through him. Like Lila. Like the life I saw in your apartment. I was supposed to have a baby, and that was it. That was the whole plan. But instead, I fell in love with both of you, and I don't know how to undo that. Mason couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. I'm sorry, Elena continued, words tumbling out now. I know that's not what you signed up for. I know this complicates everything, but I had to tell you, not just about the pregnancy, but about all of it. Because I can't come back and pretend I don't feel this way. And I can't stay away and pretend this baby doesn't have a father who deserves to be part of its life. Elena, Mason said finally, his voice rough. Stop talking for a second. She went quiet. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Mason said. Get in your car. Drive back to Seattle. Come home. Mason, I mean it. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you think is going to happen, we'll figure it out. But you can't do this alone. You shouldn't have to do this alone. And He stopped, searching for the right words. I want to be there. For all of it. Not because I made a promise, but because I care about you. Because Lila cares about you. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about a favor and became about family. Elena's breath hitched. You don't mean that. Yes, I do. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're stubborn and brilliant and scared out of your mind, but trying anyway. I know you make the best muffins I've ever tasted, and you're terrible at hiding when you're upset. I know Lila lights up when you're around, and you look at her like she's something precious. I know you've been alone for too long, and you're afraid to trust that someone might actually want to stay. Mason, come home, Elena, please. There was a long silence. Mason could hear Elena crying softly on the other end of the line, could picture her sitting in her car in some clinic parking lot, trying to hold herself together. Okay, she whispered finally. Okay. When? Tonight. I'll pack and leave tonight. Text me when you're on the road, and drive safe. I will. Elena? Yeah? We're going to figure this out, all of it, together. Okay, Elena said again, and this time there was something like hope in her voice. They hung up, and Mason sat there in the mud with his phone in his hand, trying to process what had just happened. Pregnant. Elena was pregnant. With his child. After weeks of believing it had failed, of grieving something that had never existed, it turned out the miracle had been there all along. He stood up on shaking legs and walked back to where Carlos was working. "Everything okay, boss?" Carlos asked, looking up from the trench he was digging. "Yeah," Mason said, a smile breaking across his face despite everything. "Yeah, I think it actually is." That evening, Mason sat Lila down at the kitchen table and tried to figure out how to explain what was happening. She looked at him with those two perceptive eyes, and he knew she'd sense if he tried to sugarcoat it. "Remember how I told you Elena was dealing with something hard?" he began. "Yeah." "Well, she's coming back." Lila's face lit up. "Really? When?" "Tonight, probably. Late. She's driving from Portland." "Can I stay up and wait for her?" "It's going to be really late, kiddo, past your bedtime." "I don't care. I want to see her." Mason smiled. "How about this? You go to bed at your normal time, and if she gets here before 9, I'll wake you up. Deal?" "Deal." Lila paused, then asked, "Is she okay now? The hard things she was dealing with?" Mason considered how much to tell her, how much an 8-year-old could understand about complicated adult situations. "She's getting there," he said finally. "She found out some news that was really scary at first, but turned out to be good news, and she realized she didn't want to deal with it alone." "What kind of news?" Mason took a breath. "She's going to have a baby." Lila's eyes went wide. "Really? Really? Is she married?" "No." "Then how?" Lila stopped, her face scrunching up in thought. Then her eyes got even wider. "Wait, is it your baby?" Mason felt his face heat. "How did you—" "Dad, I'm 8, not stupid. You guys were spending all that time together, and then she got really sad and left, and now she's pregnant and coming back. I can do math. It's not quite that simple." "Why not?" "Because—" Mason paused. "Because it wasn't like that. It was medical, clinical. She needed help having a baby, and I said I'd help her." "So you gave her a baby?" "Sort of. And now she's coming back?" "Yes." Lila processed this information with the seriousness of a judge. Finally, she said, "So I'm going to have a brother or sister?" "A half-sibling, technically. The baby will live with Elena." "But we'll see them?" "I hope so, if Elena wants that." "Do you want that?" Mason looked at his daughter and saw no judgment in her eyes, just genuine curiosity and something that looked like hope. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." "Good," Lila said matter-of-factly. "Because I always wanted a little brother or sister, and I like Elena. She's nice." "She is nice." "Are you going to marry her?" "Lila, it's a reasonable question. You're having a baby together." "It doesn't work like that anymore, kiddo." "Why not?" "Because people don't just get married because they're having a baby. They get married because they love each other." "Do you love Elena?" The question hit Mason like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to deflect, to say it was complicated, to give some safe adult answer that didn't really mean anything, but Lila deserved better than that. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I care about her. A lot. But love it's complicated." "Love isn't complicated," Lila said, with the certainty only a child could possess. "You either love someone or you don't. It's more complicated when you're a grown-up." "That's dumb," Mason laughed, despite himself. "You know what? You're probably right." They had dinner together, and afterward Lila kept checking the clock every few minutes, waiting for 9 o'clock to arrive. Mason tried to distract her with a movie, but she was too wired to focus, bouncing between excitement and nervous energy. At 8:30, Mason's phone buzzed. A text from Elena. "Just crossed the city limits, 15 minutes away." Mason's heart rate kicked up. "She's almost here," he told Lila. "Can I go wait in the hallway? Let's give her a few minutes to get inside first, okay?" But at 8:45, when Mason heard Elena's door open across the hall, Lila was already at their own door, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Lila, hold on!" but Lila had already yanked open the door and run into the hallway. "Elena!" Mason followed in time to see Elena drop her suitcase and crouch down just as Lila barreled into her. Elena wrapped her arms around Lila and held on tight, her eyes squeezed shut, and Mason saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I missed you so much," Lila said into Elena's shoulder. "I missed you too, sweetheart," Elena managed. They stayed like that for a long moment, and Mason stood in his doorway watching, his throat tight. When Elena finally pulled back, she looked up and met his eyes, and Mason saw everything in that look. Fear, hope, apology, love. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi yourself." Lila grabbed Elena's hand. "Dad told me about the baby. Can I feel your stomach? Is there a bump yet?" Elena laughed, a watery sound. "Not yet. It's still really small." "How small?" "About the size of a blueberry." "That's tiny." "Very tiny." Mason walked over and picked up Elena's suitcase. "Come on," he said. "You must be exhausted. Let's get you inside." They all went into Elena's apartment, which felt stale and empty from weeks of disuse. Mason set down her suitcase while Lila peppered Elena with questions about Portland and the drive and the baby. Finally, Mason said, "Lila, why don't you head back to our place? It's past your bedtime." "But I'll come tuck you in a few minutes. I need to talk to Elena first." Lila looked between them, then nodded with exaggerated understanding. "Grown-up talk. Got it." She hugged Elena again. "I'm really glad you're back." "Me too," Elena said. After Lila left, Mason and Elena stood in the middle of her dark apartment, the silence heavy between them. "I'm sorry," Elena said finally, "for running, for staying away, for not telling you sooner about the baby. For all of it. I understand why you did." "Do you?" "You were scared. You'd already been hurt so many times. It makes sense that you'd want to protect yourself." "That doesn't make it okay." "No," Mason agreed, "but it makes it human." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, and Mason noticed for the first time how thin she'd gotten, how exhausted she looked. "Have you been eating?" he asked. "Not much. The morning sickness is pretty bad." "Have you eaten today?" "A granola bar this morning." "Elena, that's not enough, especially not—" He stopped. "Come on, I'm making you dinner." "Mason, you don't have to." "I know, I want to. Come on." He led her across the hall to his apartment, sat her down at the kitchen table, and started pulling out leftovers from the fridge. Lila appeared in her pajamas, and Mason shooed her back to bed with a promise he'd be there in 10 minutes. He heated up soup and made toast, setting both in front of Elena with a glass of water. She picked at it at first, then started eating with more enthusiasm, like her body had suddenly remembered it was starving. "Thank you," she said between bites. "You're welcome. I mean for everything, for not giving up on me, for the emails, for taking my call today, for—" Her voice caught. "For wanting me to come back." Mason sat down across from her. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" "I didn't know what to think. I was so sure you'd hate me for running, for keeping this from you." "I don't hate you, Elena. I could never hate you." "Why not? I've done nothing but complicate your life." "You've done a lot more than that." Mason reached across the table and took her hand. "You've made it bigger, warmer, more full. And yeah, it's complicated, but the best things usually are." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve you." "That's not how this works." "How does it work then?" Mason squeezed her hand. "We figure it out together, day by day. One step at a time, just like we said at the beginning." "I'm scared," Elena whispered. "I know, me too." "What if I miscarry? What if something goes wrong?" "Then we deal with it together." "What if I'm a terrible mother?" "You won't be." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do, because you already love this baby. I can see it in your eyes when you talk about it. That's all you need to start with." Elena broke down then, covering her face with her free hand, and Mason moved around the table to hold her. She clung to him and cried, releasing weeks of fear and loneliness and desperate hope, and Mason held her through all of it. When she finally quieted, he said softly, "Stay here tonight." Elena pulled back. "What?" "Not like that. But you're exhausted, and your apartment's been empty for weeks, and you shouldn't be alone. Take the couch, or Lila's room. She can sleep with me. Just stay. Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. Then she nodded. Okay. Mason got her blankets and a pillow, setting her up on the couch. He checked on Lila, who'd fallen asleep waiting for him, and tucked her in. When he came back out, Elena was curled up under the blanket, her eyes already heavy. Mason? She said as he turned off the living room light. Yeah? Thank you for not giving up on me. I told you, I don't break promises. No, thank you for not giving up on us, on the possibility of us. Mason's heart stuttered. Get some sleep, Elena. We'll talk more tomorrow. Okay. Good night. Good night. Mason went to his room and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind spun with everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. Elena was back. She was pregnant. She'd said she loved him, or as good as said it, and he'd realized somewhere in the chaos of the last few hours that he felt the same way. Somewhere between that first desperate knock on his door and tonight, Elena Hart had worked her way into his life so completely that he couldn't imagine it without her anymore. And tomorrow, they'd start figuring out what that meant. Mason woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet voices in his kitchen. He pulled on a shirt and padded down the hallway to find Lila and Elena at the table, heads bent together over a coloring book. Elena looked better than she had last night, still pale, still exhausted, but there was color in her cheeks and something softer in her expression. Morning, Mason said. Both looked up. Lila grinned. Elena's teaching me how to draw butterflies, real ones, not cartoon ones. I see that. Mason moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, then glanced at Elena. How are you feeling? Better. The nausea comes in waves, but right now I'm okay. Good. They fell into an easy rhythm over the next few days. Elena officially moved back into her apartment but spent most of her time across the hall. She'd show up for breakfast, help Lila get ready for school, and then retreat to rest while Mason went to work. In the evenings, they'd have dinner together, the three of them, and it felt startlingly natural, like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. But underneath the domesticity, there were conversations they hadn't had yet, questions that hung in the air, unspoken but pressing. A week after Elena's return, after Lila had gone to bed, Mason finally brought it up. They were sitting on his couch, Elena curled in one corner with her feet tucked under her, Mason at the other end. The TV was on, but neither of them was watching it. We need to talk, Mason said, about what happens next. Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, which was just starting to show the slightest curve. I know. I meant what I said on the phone. I want to be involved, not just financially or occasionally, really involved. I want that too. But I need to understand what that looks like to you. Because we never talked about this. About what would happen if it actually worked. Elena was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. I didn't let myself think that far ahead. Every other time I've been pregnant, I miscarried before 12 weeks. I couldn't imagine getting past that point, let alone actually having a baby to bring home. And now? Now I'm 10 weeks and terrified every single day that I'm going to lose this, that I'm going to wake up bleeding and it'll all be over. Have you had any complications? Any signs that something's wrong? No? The doctor in Portland said everything looked perfect. Strong heartbeat, good growth, all my levels where they should be, but that doesn't mean... She stopped, swallowing hard. It doesn't mean it'll stay that way. Mason moved closer, taking her hand. You can't live in fear of what might happen. You'll drive yourself crazy. I know, but I don't know how to stop. By taking it one day at a time, one appointment at a time, one milestone at a time. Elena nodded, but Mason could see the fear still shadowed in her eyes. When's your next appointment? He asked. Thursday. The first one back in Seattle. I need to transfer my care from Portland to here. Can I come with you? Elena looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. You want to? Of course I want to. This is my kid too. Something shifted in Elena's expression, softening. Okay, yes, I'd like that. Thursday came and Mason took the morning off work. They drove to the clinic together and Mason noticed Elena's hands shaking as she filled out paperwork in the waiting room. Hey, he said quietly, covering her hand with his. It's going to be okay. You don't know that. No, but worrying won't change the outcome. It'll just steal whatever peace you could have right now. Elena managed a weak smile. When did you get so wise? I've had a lot of practice managing fear. The ultrasound tech called them back, and Mason followed Elena into a dimmed room with a large monitor on the wall. Elena changed into a gown and lay back on the exam table, and Mason stood beside her, his hand finding hers automatically. The tech squeezed gel onto Elena's stomach and pressed the wand against her skin, moving it slowly. Static filled the monitor, gray and white and incomprehensible to Mason's untrained eye. Then the tech stopped, clicking a few buttons, and suddenly there it was. A tiny form on the screen, almost alien in its shape, but unmistakably human. And there, in the center, a rapid flutter. There's the heartbeat, the tech said, turning up the volume. The sound filled the room, fast and strong and impossibly real. Mason stared at the screen, unable to look away, unable to breathe. That was his child, his and Elena's. A real living person who hadn't existed 6 months ago and now had a heartbeat and fingers and toes. He looked down at Elena and saw tears streaming down her face. It's still there, she whispered. It's still alive. Heart rate looks great, the tech said cheerfully, taking measurements. 162 beats per minute. Baby's measuring right on track for 10 weeks, 3 days. Everything looks perfect. Elena squeezed Mason's hand so hard it hurt, but he didn't pull away, just stood there holding her while she cried with relief. After the appointment, they sat in the parking lot for a long time, neither speaking. Finally, Elena said, I've never made it this far before. 10 weeks it's the longest I've ever been pregnant. That's good, right? That means this one's sticking. Maybe. The risk of miscarriage drops significantly after 12 weeks. If I can just make it 2 more weeks, you will. You can't know that. Then I'll believe it enough for both of us. Elena looked at him, and Mason saw something break open in her expression. Why are you so good to me? Because you deserve it. I ran away. I kept this from you. I've done everything wrong. You've done what you needed to survive. There's nothing wrong with that. Elena reached out and cupped his face with her hand, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. I meant what I said on the phone. I do have feelings for you, real ones. The kind I've been trying to talk myself out of for weeks because they terrify me. Mason's heart hammered. Why do they terrify you? Because I don't know how to do this. I've spent my entire adult life alone, Mason. I don't know how to be part of something, how to let someone in, how to trust that they'll stay. I'm not going anywhere. You don't know that either. Yes, I do. Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to build walls so high you convince yourself you don't need anyone. But those walls don't keep you safe, Elena. They just keep you lonely. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not? She stopped, struggling for words. What if I'm not enough? Mason leaned forward until their foreheads touched. You're already enough. You've always been enough. Elena closed her eyes, breathing him in. I want to believe that. Then start. They stayed like that for a long moment, suspended in the quiet intimacy of 2 people learning to trust each other with the fragile, broken pieces they usually kept hidden. Then Elena pulled back and said, There's something else we need to talk about custody and co-parenting and how this is actually going to work. Mason nodded. Okay. I know we said no lawyers at the beginning, but we should probably have some kind of agreement, something in writing, about where the baby lives, how much time you get, child support. I don't want child support. Mason, I mean it. I don't need your money. I make enough to support myself and Lila. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it because I want to be a father to this kid, not because I need financial compensation. That's not fair to you. Let me decide what's fair to me. Elena looked at him for a long moment. What do you want then? In terms of custody? Mason thought about it. I want to be there. For everything. Doctor's appointments, sleepless nights, first words, first steps. I want this kid to know me, to know they have a father who loves them. That's what I want too. But where does the baby live? Elena's hand moved to her stomach again. I've been thinking about that. A lot. And the truth is, I don't know how to do this alone. I've seen how hard it is watching you with Lila. You make it look easy, but I know it's not. It's exhausting and relentless, and you never get a break. It is all those things. And I'm terrified of failing, of being one of those mothers who's great at her job but can't figure out how to keep a baby alive. What if I can't breastfeed? What if I can't handle the crying? What if... Elena, stop. You're spiraling. I know, but I can't help it. Mason took her hands in both of his. What if we did this together? Elena blinked. What do you mean? What if we co-parented for real? Not separate apartments with a custody schedule, but actually together, under the same roof. Mason, we're not even, you can't just, why not? Because that's marriage without marriage. That's raising a child together when we've known each other for 3 months. It's crazy. Maybe, but it's also the only thing that makes sense to me. Because the truth is, I don't want to be a weekend dad. I don't want to miss bedtimes and morning routines and all the little moments in between. And I don't think you want to do this alone. Elena stared at him, her eyes wide. What are you saying? I'm saying move in with me, you and the baby. We'll figure out the details as we go, but we'll do it together. That's insane, is it? We already spend every day together. You're already part of Lila's life. This just makes it official. But we're not in a relationship. Not really. Mason smiled. Aren't we? Elena opened her mouth, then closed it, opened it again. I don't know what we are. Then let's find out. No pressure, no expectations, just let's see what this could be. And if it doesn't work, then we figure that out too. But at least we tried. Elena looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Mason saw the war happening behind her eyes, fear fighting hope, self-protection battling trust. Finally, she whispered, Okay. Okay? Okay. Yes. I'll move in. We'll try this. Mason felt something enormous and terrifying and wonderful expand in his chest. Yeah? Yeah, eh? Elena laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. Neither can I, honestly. We're completely insane. Probably. This is going to be a disaster. Maybe. Or maybe it'll be the best decision we ever made. Elena leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative and tasted like hope and tears, and when she pulled back, her eyes were shining. Let's find out, she said. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics and adjustments. Elena slowly moved her things from her apartment into Mason's, and they navigated the awkwardness of sharing space in new ways. Where things went, who cooked when, how to give each other privacy while also building something together. Lila adapted with the easy flexibility of childhood, thrilled to have Elena around full-time. She helped Elena unpack, chattering endlessly about where things should go and what the baby would need. We should paint the nursery yellow, Lila announced one evening. That works for boys or girls. We don't even know what we're having yet, Elena said, smiling. Can you find out? Elena looked at Mason. They talked about this. Do you want to know? She asked him. I don't care either way. What about you? I think I want to know. I want to be able to picture them, plan for them. Then we'll find out. The anatomy scan was scheduled for 18 weeks. Mason and Elena went together, and this time Lila came too, bouncing with excitement in the waiting room. The ultrasound took longer this time, the tech measuring everything, checking organs and bones and fluid levels. Mason watched the monitor, amazed at how much the baby had grown. They looked like a real person now, not just a blob. He could see fingers and toes, a nose, a profile. Everything looks perfect, the tech said. Would you like to know the sex? Elena reached for Mason's hand. Yes. The tech smiled and pointed at the screen. Congratulations. You're having a boy. Mason felt something crack wide open in his chest. A boy. A son. He looked at Elena and saw tears streaming down her face. Looked at Lila, who was grinning so wide it looked like her face might split. I'm getting a brother, Lila squealed. Half-brother, Elena corrected gently, but Lila waved her off. Brother, that's what counts. That night, after Lila was asleep, Mason and Elena sat on the couch together. Elena had her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, her hand resting on her growing belly. A boy, she said softly. I can't believe it. Believe it. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll be here no matter what. Elena tilted her head to look up at him. How did I get so lucky? Finding you? I ask myself the same thing about you. I'm not lucky. I'm a mess. You're my mess. Elena laughed and swatted his chest. That's the least romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Sorry, I'm not good at this. At what? Romance, sweet talk, all of it. You're better at it than you think. Elena shifted so she was facing him fully. Can I tell you something? Always. I love you. Mason's breath caught. She'd implied it before, danced around it, but she'd never said it outright. I love you, Elena repeated, more firmly now. I tried not to. Tried to convince myself this was just proximity and hormones and gratitude. But it's not. It's real. You're the first person I think about when I wake up, and the last person I think about before I fall asleep. You've made me feel less alone than I've felt in 20 years, and I love you for that. For all of it. Mason cupped her face in his hands. I love you too. I've been in love with you since you showed up at my door with those muffins, pretending you'd made too many when we both knew you'd baked them specifically for us. Elena laughed through her tears. I did make too many. You made exactly the right amount. He kissed her then, properly, and Elena melted into him. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. So what does this mean? She asked. Are we dating? In a relationship? What do we call this? I don't know. What do you want to call it? Elena thought about it. How about we just call it home? Mason smiled. Home works for me. The months that followed were both harder and easier than Mason expected. Elena's pregnancy progressed smoothly, but she struggled with anxiety, convinced something would go wrong even as week after week passed with perfect checkups. Mason learned to talk her down from panic spirals, to hold her when the fear got too overwhelming, to remind her to breathe. They argued sometimes, about small things mostly, how to load the dishwasher, whether the thermostat was too high, whose turn it was to do laundry. But they learned to fight fair, to say sorry, to remember they were on the same team. Lila flourished with Elena around, and watching them together made Mason's chest ache in the best way. Elena helped with homework and braided hair and remembered to ask about school plays and soccer games. She wasn't trying to be Lila's mother. They both knew she could never replace Claire, even if Claire had never really been there. But she was something just as important, a constant, caring presence. At 30 weeks, Elena's doctor ordered her on modified bed rest for high blood pressure. She chafed against the restriction, hating feeling useless. But Mason made her stay on the couch while he and Lila took over everything else. I'm supposed to be helping, Elena protested one evening as Mason brought her dinner on a tray. You are helping. By growing a whole human. That's enough. I feel like a burden. You're not a burden, you're family. The words settled between them, warm and solid. At 37 weeks, Elena woke Mason in the middle of the night, her hand on his shoulder. Mason, I think it's time. He bolted upright, suddenly wide awake. Time? Like baby time? My water just broke. They moved into organized chaos. Mason called his brother to come stay with Lila, who woke up long enough to hug Elena and whisper, "Good luck," before falling back asleep. He grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago and helped Elena to the truck, timing contractions that were already closer together than he'd expected. The hospital was a blur of bright lights and nurses and monitoring equipment. Elena labored for 14 hours, and Mason stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, breathing with her, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. I can't do this, Elena gasped at hour 12, exhausted and in pain. Yes, you can. I'm not strong enough. You're the strongest person I know. I'm scared. I know, but I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. And he wasn't. He stayed through every contraction, every push, every moment of doubt and fear and overwhelming intensity. And then, at 4:17 in the afternoon on a gray March day, their son entered the world with a fierce cry that echoed off the delivery room walls. The nurse placed him on Elena's chest, and Mason watched Elena's face transform. All the fear and exhaustion and pain melted away. replaced by something so pure and powerful it made his eyes sting. "Hi," Elena whispered to the baby, her voice breaking. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm your mama." The baby quieted at her voice, his tiny fist curling against her skin, and Elena looked up at Mason with tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." Mason leaned down and kissed her forehead, then looked at his son, really looked at him. The dark hair plastered to his small head, the perfect tiny fingers, the way his mouth moved, searching. "He's perfect," Mason whispered. "He looks like you. He looks like us." The nurse took the baby to clean him up and check vitals, and Mason held Elena's hand while she was stitched up, both of them unable to stop staring at the small bundle across the room. "What should we name him?" Elena asked. They'd talked about names but never settled on one, both superstitious about choosing before he was safely here. Mason thought about it. "What about Daniel? Danny?" Elena smiled. "Daniel Reed Hart. Or Daniel Hart Reed. Let's hyphenate. Reed Hart. Works for me." When they brought Danny back, cleaned and swaddled, Mason held his son for the first time. The weight of him was impossibly light, his head fitting perfectly in the crook of Mason's arm, and Mason felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This was his son. His and Elena's, a life they'd created together, carried together, and would raise together. "Hi, Danny," Mason whispered. "I'm your dad." Jake brought Lila to the hospital that evening. She tiptoed into the room, eyes wide, and stared at the tiny bundle in Elena's arms. "That's my brother?" she whispered. "That's your brother," Elena confirmed. "Want to meet him?" Lila nodded solemnly. Elena patted the bed beside her, and Lila climbed up carefully. Elena adjusted so Lila could see Danny's face, and Lila reached out one finger to touch his hand. Danny's tiny fingers curled around Lila's, and she gasped. "He's holding my hand." "He is," Mason said, his throat tight. "He's so small." "You were this small once, too." "Really? Really?" Lila stared at Danny with an expression of complete wonder. "I'm going to teach him everything," she announced. "How to color and read and ride a bike and everything." "I'm sure he'll love that," Elena said softly. They stayed like that for a long time, the four of them together in the quiet hospital room while the world moved on outside. That night, after Lila had gone home with Jake and Elena had fallen asleep with Danny in the bassinet beside her bed, Mason stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. 6 months ago, his life had been simple, predictable, safe. And then Elena had knocked on his door with an impossible request, and everything had changed. He'd gained a partner, a son, a family he'd never planned for but couldn't imagine living without. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Congratulations, man. He's beautiful. You doing okay?" Mason typed back, "Better than okay. I'm home." Because that's what this was. Not the apartment, or the city, or the building, but the people. Elena and Danny and Lila. They were his home. 2 days later, they brought Danny home to the apartment that now belonged to all of them. Elena was exhausted but glowing, cradling Danny against her chest while Mason carried in the car seat and hospital bags. Lila had made a banner that said, "Welcome home, Danny," and hung it in the living room, along with a drawing she'd made of their family, her and Mason and Elena, and a small bundle labeled "Baby." "You made us a family," Lila explained, pointing at the drawing. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect." That first week was chaos, sleepless nights and endless feedings and the steep learning curve of caring for a newborn. But they figured it out together, taking shifts, supporting each other, learning Danny's cries and rhythms and needs. Mason watched Elena with Danny and saw her bloom into motherhood in a way he knew she doubted she ever would. She was gentle and patient and fiercely protective, and every time she looked at their son, Mason fell more in love with her. One night when Danny was 2 weeks old, Mason found Elena sitting in the nursery at 3 a.m, rocking their son and crying quietly. "Hey," he said softly. "What's wrong? Is Danny okay?" "He's fine. Perfect. That's why I'm crying. Mason sat down on the floor beside the rocking chair. I don't understand. I spent so many years convinced this would never happen, that I'd never get to hold my baby, never get to do any of this. And now he's here and he's healthy, and I keep waiting to wake up and find out it was all a dream. It's not a dream. I know, but it feels impossible, like I don't deserve this much happiness. Mason reached up and took her hand. You deserve all of it. Every sleepless night and dirty diaper and beautiful moment. You deserve this family. Elena looked down at him, and in the dim glow of the nightlight, Mason saw everything he needed to know in her eyes. Marry me, he said. Elena's rocking stopped. What? Marry me. Not because we have a baby together or because it's what people expect. Marry me because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life figuring this out with you, because you're already my family and I want to make it official. Mason, you don't have to answer now. Just think about it. But Elena was already nodding, tears streaming down her face. Yes. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Of course I'll marry you. Mason stood and kissed her carefully, mindful of the sleeping baby in her arms. And when they pulled apart, they were both crying. I don't have a ring, Mason said. I don't care about a ring. You should have one. All I need is you and Lila and Danny. That's enough. And it was. They got married 3 months later in Jake's backyard with Lila as the flower girl and Danny sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms during the ceremony. It was small and simple and perfect, just family and a few close friends, vows they'd written themselves, and a future stretching out before them full of possibility. Standing under a makeshift arch of flowers, holding Elena's hand while she held their son, Mason thought about that rainy evening 6 months ago when she'd knocked on his door. How terrified she'd been. How uncertain he'd been. How neither of them could have predicted this outcome. I love you, he whispered as the officiant pronounced them married. I love you too, Elena whispered back. And when they kissed, with their children between them and their family cheering around them, Mason knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because it was easy or expected or even logical, but because it was real. Because it was theirs. Because 4 strangers had become a family. And in the end, that was the only miracle that mattered.